But you have to get to the root. What has caused so much, concupiscence or sexual desire to overtake America? I mean, is it not just coming from Hollywood?
The people. Look, I just went through this. I just did a piece on Archbishop Chaput. Archbishop Chaput wrote "Strangers in a Strange Land." He gave a lecture before First Things, and he said, over the past 20 years, we've had a shocking transformation in our culture. The people now who are just representing what were common sense moral views of 20 years ago are now being demonized as homophobes. And then he said, how did this happen? And he says, well, I read a book by a man named Christian Smith, and he said, basically, during this period of time, secularizing activists took over our culture. Secularizing activists? What do you mean? Have you ever met a secularizing activist? Can you look them up in the phone book? Do they live in Indiana or do they live in Michigan? What are you talking about? Well, this is a euphemism. Well, what's it a euphemism for?
Non-Christian Jewish radicals? I don't know.
The Jew.
The Jewish radicals.
Basically, the Jew who subverted all the institutions of our culture, beginning with the Supreme Court, school prayer. Where do you want to begin? School prayer. Beginning in the 60s, there was this era of judicial activism that the Jews were heavily involved in. The AJC, the American Jewish Committee, was behind the school prayer decision, Schempp versus Abington, which happened right near where I lived. Okay.
Well, you can name, like you mentioned before, they subverted psychiatry, and they got the condemnation of homosexuality
removed. There's not one institution where they haven't. And so, what is the problem here? Chaput is saying, well, now we have gay marriage. How are we going to fight against gay marriage? Well, they lost that battle. Why did they lose that battle? Because they cannot identify the enemy. And why can they not identify the enemy? Because they can't bring themselves to say the word Jew. Enemy because they can't bring themselves to say the word Jew. Enemy because they can't bring themselves to say the word Jew. Now, if you go to, that sounds like I'm an anti-Semite every time I say this. But if you go to Tikkun magazine, which is a Jewish magazine, and you go to an article by Amy Dean says, it was Jews that gave us gay marriage. Thank God for Jews.
Because Joe Biden said the same thing.
Joe Biden said the same thing. And then she goes and names the names. Rabbi David Saperstein was a crusader for gay marriage. His wife is Ellen Weiss. She ran the newsroom at NPR. It was a Jewish project from beginning to end. This is what Amy Dean said. And here we have a poor Archbishop Chaput who can't identify who his opponent is in the culture wars. So they have something like the Manhattan Declaration. Do you remember the Manhattan Declaration? Everybody came out and said, we think gay marriage is ridiculous. That was 2009. They just blew it away. Amy Dean mentioned the Manhattan Declaration. That was the brainchild of Robbie George of Princeton, who is the brain trust for the Catholic Church. Well, they got blown out of the water, and Amy Dean mentioned the Manhattan Declaration specifically.
That it didn't have any weight.
It didn't have any effect whatsoever. So the point here is, you're not going to have any effect until you identify who your opponent is in the culture wars. That's what Sun Tzu said in The Art of War. He said a long time ago, the Chinese philosopher.
But in a sense, it starts in the seminary where they have to be militantly pursuing holiness and controlling their sexual desires. But if they're being influenced to express their sexual desires in the name of some...
Well, that was also what happened in the seminary. That was a black op, too. And the net result was the pedophile crisis.
Right, so you go
into these people and say, act on your sexual... As a matter of fact, Eric Erickson, Eugene Kennedy did a survey that was commissioned by the U.S. bishops, and he applied Eric Erickson's theory of sexual maturity, 7 stages of maturity, and if you don't have sex with someone, you're not a mature person. Well, tell that to a celibate priest, and guess what happens? They start acting out on their sexual impulses. And when you act out on your sexual impulses outside of reason, that becomes a monster, and that monster destroys you.
And you become enslaved to it.
You become a slave to that monster, which was the state of all of these Middle Eastern cultures until Gilgamesh came along, or until Theseus came along and killed the bull, or until Moses came along and broke the golden calf, which was a bull. Remember? That's what you're worshiping. They were worshiping the bull.
How curious this celestial monster called the Bull of Heaven, an archetype with origins in prehistoric times. When civilization began, the Bull of Heaven was already present in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, but the influence of the archetype extended far more broadly, with literary, symbolic, and ritual echoes continuing into modern times. In the ancient Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh, the bull is Gugal-Anna, the great bull of heaven. The crescent form of the Sumerian god Nannar, the Babylonian sin, shines in the heavens as the horns of the bull of heaven. A similar power appears in the Egyptian pyramid text in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. There it said people stood in fear and awe of the great bull Kenset, with shining horns. The name is translated as the Bull of Heaven. Across the centuries, an archetypal memory was progressively localized through tribal storytelling and reenactment. We see the early tendency toward localization in the Sumerian and Babylonian accounts of the local hero Gilgamesh slaughtering the great bull of heaven. The Persian Mithra defeats the bull of heaven on a landscape of uncertain definition, while his Greek counterpart, the legendary Theseus, vanquishes the Minotaur in the center of a great labyrinth localized on the island of Crete. And of course the Greek Heracles, the Latin Hercules, amongst his famous labors, slays the Cretan bull, which could hardly be different from the Cretan Minotaur slain by Theseus. In due course, this celestial creature was progressively transmuted into local reenactments for popular entertainment. And what does it mean when we consistently find close by the beautiful princess, the literary echo of the mother goddess? Well, of course, the experts leapt to a conclusion, perhaps the only conclusion conceivable under common assumptions. Surely the crescent horns identify the celestial bull with our moon. But does the moon really give us the recurrent details of the archetype? It's ironic that the late 19th century scholar Peter Jensen, in his groundbreaking study of Mesopotamian astronomy, Die Kosmologie der Babylonier, unequivocally identified the crescentine god Sin as the planet Saturn. As the planet Saturn. As the planet Saturn.
Well, the training used to go through, to become a leader in the church, you had to kind of go through strict boot camp of, like, say, a monastery, proving that you had control over your sexual passions, maybe primarily.
Yeah.
So because without that, you can't get a hold of Logos. You can't see Christ in a way.
Lust darkens the mind. That's what Thomas Aquinas said.
Right.
And it divides the will. Darkens the mind and divides the will.
So you have
feckless Catholic leaders like Notre Dame. How many times have they changed their position on contraception, funding contraception, within a 6-month period? I don't even know what it is. Does anyone know what it is anymore? No. Because they have a divided will, and I've already mentioned what the cause of the divided will is. Okay? So that is the problem here. That is the problem here. But we can't say, okay, that's the monster. No, you're saying we should vote for the guy, but no, we're saying, wait a minute, no, it's a monster. And so there's this contest between the oligarchs who control the culture and the people who actually are part of the political process who actually vote for somebody. There's a conflict here.